Douglas Adams was early for his train. So early, in fact, he decided that he had time to go and pick up some breakfast. So he went to the local gift shop and he bought himself a large coffee, a newspaper so he could do the crossword, and a big sleeve of cookies. After going and purchasing that, he goes back into the waiting area for his train and he finds a table. It's so crowded that he has to share the table with another gentleman. That gentleman is sitting there in a suit with his briefcase down on the ground beside the table. Douglas sits down, he puts his cookies down, he opens up his newspaper and he pulls out the crossword section. He puts his newspaper down on the table and he sets down his coffee cup. And he begins to look at the paper. He engrosses himself in the paper because he doesn't want to talk to the man. He wants some private time to himself, so he's working intently on that crossword puzzle. And then a few moments later, he hears a ripping sound. And then he hears a crunching. And he looks up from his crossword, and sure enough, the man across the table from him has opened a package of cookies and has taken a cookie out and has eaten the first cookie in the sleeve. Douglas can't believe it. The audacity of this man. But he's an Englishman and he's in England and it's not right to throw a fit. So he looks down at his paper and tries to bide his time deciding what he should do. What would you do in a situation like that? You'd probably sit down your paper and go, "What are you doing?" Or, "Hi, I'm Paul. Nice to meet you. Those are my cookies." But it's not proper for Douglas, so Douglas focuses on his paper and he decides, here's what I'll do. I'm going to establish dominance right here and right now. So he grabs the sleeve of cookies and he pulls them to him. And he takes out a cookie and he looks at the man and he begins eating one of the cookies. He puts down the sleeve, he pulls back his paper, problem solved. Until he hears the rustling of foil. And the man across the table pulls out a second cookie and eats the cookie. And Douglas, as he tells the story, he says it goes on like that for what felt like an interminable amount of time. He and the stranger at the table, each taking one cookie after another until the sleeve is empty. And when the man takes the last cookie in the sleeve and finishes the cookie, he looks up at Douglas, gives him a nod, gets up, and walks away from the table. Douglas can't believe it. How crazy was this situation? He thought, when I get home, I'm telling my wife, and she's going to be as flabbergasted as I am about what this man chose to do with my cookies. And then the call goes because the train has arrived, and it's time for him to pack his stuff up. So he grabs his cup of coffee, now empty. He grabs the foil package that's now empty of cookies, and he picks up his newspaper, and underneath his newspaper is his sleeve of cookies. I want to read to you what he said upon discovering that the cookies that he had eaten were indeed not his cookies. They were the other man's. He said this. He said, when the train came in and I had drunk my coffee, stood up, picked up the newspaper, and saw that underneath my newspaper was an unopened package of cookies. I boarded the train with the realization that somewhere in England, there's been wandering around a perfectly ordinary man who has the exact same story as mine, only he doesn't have the punchline. That man is going home to tell his wife about the audacity of the crazy crossword man who ate his cookies. As we turn to Luke chapter 7 and go over what we read during communion and the reading that we had before, we have a story of a man who thinks all the cookies are his. That they're his cookies and not hers. That he has the right to determine who gets what from whom. And how often, you see, a story changes when you realize that what you thought you'd earned was indeed the result of mercy and not yours. I imagine Douglas's conversations in his head went to an abrupt halt, went from I should have said this to this guy too. How can I apologize to this man? I wonder if I can find him later and say, man, I'm sorry for what I took from you. How can I change my tune? Everything changed for Douglas the moment he realized the cookies weren't his. And that he had been enjoying grace and mercy, when in his mind he had been trying to figure out how to administer justice and punishment. You see, everything changes when we realize that what we think we have earned is a result of mercy and not our righteous actions and good deeds. How quickly would that change your attitude? If you'd been the individual in that story, how would your thoughts have changed if you'd experienced something like that? Realizing that every cookie that you took, that you thought was yours, was actually a gift and not a right. You see, we all tend to think that others should live according to our own experiences and that they should overcome the things that we have to overcome. We say things like, oh, it's good for them to experience this hardship. I experienced that hardship, and it led to this in me. Oh, man, that guy needs to be cut down to size. I know what it did for me. Or they need to take this opportunity. I took this opportunity, and look what happened to me. Or I experienced that hardship, and I came out all right. Or I never struggled with this, so why would anybody else struggle with this same thing? We all tend to judge people according to our own experiences and our own understandings. It's just a tendency of humankind because we're human and they're human, so we should have the same mindset. It should just come naturally. But any of us who have lived any kind of life know that that is not the truth. That it's our story and our experiences that determine our outlook. And no one has the same story. And no one has the same experiences. Now, we know what good is and we know what bad is. And most of the time we can easily determine between the two. But it's that middle ground that gets really wonky for us. It gets difficult for us. And what it means is that we judge from history and not reality. So I want you to ask this question today. What if everything you've been enjoying in your life is a gift and not a right? What if the good job that you thought that you earned all on your own accolades was a blessing from the Lord, and He put things in place so that you could choose to take the opportunity? Now, you made the choice. You took the job, and you've worked diligently. But what if it was a mercy and not a right? What if it was given to you and you didn't earn every single thing that you'd gotten? What if there were some connections in place that allowed you to experience some of the blessings that you've experienced, and without those connections, you might not have experienced them? As we enter into the story of Luke chapter 7, I want you to see the story that reveals that our harsh judgment of others reveals our inability to judge ourselves. The more difficult you are towards someone else, the more inept you are at seeing yourself. The more harshly you judge another person's situation, the more inaccurately you realize your own. I think this is what Jesus is teaching. And I think it's something that we can see. And what it reveals to me is that I often judge by history and not reality. That I often look at someone's situation from their history and don't see them in their present. You see, when this Pharisee looks at this woman who comes in and lays herself down at the feet of Jesus, what he sees is her past, and he does not see her present. The questions that he asked about her are based on who she was in the moments before and not who she is in the moment right now. And the call of Jesus is to judge people and see people as they are, not as they were. Because it is Jesus Christ himself who determines what we become and gives us our identity. And so we should learn to judge from his story instead of history. Let's turn to Luke chapter 7 and let's look through this story. Starting in verse 36, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. If you're not familiar with the word Pharisee, basically he is an expert in religious law. He is the guy who gives instruction. He is the man who is expected to, with authority, tell a person what they should or shouldn't do according to the words of the Old Testament law. They call it the Torah. And so if you had a question about the law, you would come to this Pharisee. And if you were living in a way that wasn't in accordance to the law, you would get a visit from this Pharisee. He was a well-respected man in his society, and he was wealthy enough to throw a party and invite a person who is on the come-up as much as Jesus to his house. So he invites Jesus to his house, and Jesus shows up for dinner. He went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at this Pharisee's house. We don't know what the sin is. We just know that she's had a sinful life. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Now clearly, she's not invited to the dinner. But the man who is there is so important to her that she's willing to crash the party. So it's urgent to her that she comes into the presence of Jesus. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. That statement, it just confused me a little bit when I read it, because there's this picture of her standing at Jesus' feet, and the tears are falling from her cheeks onto his feet. I've always pictured her on her knees, leaned over the feet, just crying on them. But the tears are coming down so profusely that those who are not rushing down her neck and into her clothing are falling from the apples of her cheeks onto his toes and his feet. She's weeping that hard. It's a massive amount of tears. It's a serious response in the presence of Jesus. And so we begin to ask why. Why would she respond so strongly to the presence of Jesus? We haven't read that she said anything to him. We've read that she's just come into his presence, and the being in his presence has called this kind of response from her towards him. Kudos to the Pharisee for not tossing her out immediately. Right? I'm sure he was aghast that she'd come into his house. But he doesn't demand she leave. But then also he uses her as a test, which is a little disingenuous as well. Verse 39, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he'd know who was touching him and what kind of woman she is, and that she is a sinner. So he's sitting there thinking, I know that Jesus is not who he claims to be. If Jesus was this great, wise teacher who knew people's hearts, he would know her heart and he would toss her out. I wouldn't be the one having to consider whether or not to allow her to be in my home, because he himself, the great teacher, would tell her that she does not belong here. If he was a prophet, he would know who it was who was kissing my feet, or his feet. He would know where those lips had been. So he was concerned with where those lips had been instead of where those lips were now. I'm sure he thought that a real man of God would see the real person and not the posturing that's happening before him. And I wondered as I read that story, how does the writer of this gospel know what the man is thinking? How does the writer of the gospel know that the Pharisee is having these thoughts about Jesus? It's not made clear in the story that the Pharisee went to Jesus and said, Jesus, at first, I was thinking, why was this lady here? But then, now that I've gotten to know you and I've seen the way that she's lived, now I know exactly why you did what you did. No, it's because Jesus is the person who's not blind to the reality, and the Pharisee is. You see, Jesus must have known his heart and told Luke about the character of the Pharisee. In the retelling, maybe they're sitting around the fire and they're laughing at the response of how crazy the situation was, and Jesus was like, guys, you know, all this while, he thought it was me who couldn't see. And you know what really makes me sad? What really breaks my heart is it wasn't just this woman who had an opportunity with me. It was the Pharisee who did as well. And you know what's crazy? The thing he was judging me for was the absolute thing that he was guilty of. What he thought of me was actually true of him. You know, Scripture tells us that the measure that we use to judge other people is the measurement that we will be judged by. And you see the reality right here in the story. Because Jesus is revealing the judgment as the story is being shared. The Pharisee thought this of me, but what he thought of me was really true of him. And that's why I say that most often our judgment of others serves to illustrate our ineptitude and our inability and our blindness to even judge ourselves. Because here's what I believe is true. I believe that our love for God is determined by our understanding of his mercy towards us. That the fullness of the extent of how deeply you will love God is limited by the understanding of how merciful he's been towards you. Because if you think that you have lived a really good life and you've only been forgiven of a few things, well, first off, you're wrong. But second off, if you think that, you won't love God to the extent that he's called you to love him. And in fact, you may not love him at all. And so we read in verse 40 that Jesus turns to the Pharisee named Simon. He says, Simon, I've got something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed them 500 denarii. Incidentally, 500 denarii is 8 years of wages. We knew it was a significant amount just between the 500 against 50. But one man owed Jesus 8 years, or not Jesus, owed the other man 8 years of wages. 8 years in back pay he owed this man. And the other 50, 10 months of wages. Still a significant amount, but nowhere near the amount of 8 years. Verse 42, neither of them had the money to pay him back. So he forgave the debts of both. And then Jesus asks the question, now which one will love him more? It's an easy answer. It's a no-brainer, right? For us, we know who's going to be more grateful, but he doesn't use the word grateful. He uses the word love. Which one will love him more? The man who's been forgiven for 8 years of debt, or the man who's been forgiven for 10 months of debt? It's an easy answer. The 8-year forgiveness obviously gets the deeper appreciation. And Jesus says, no, we're not talking about appreciation. We're talking about love and devotion. Because when you realize that you've been forgiven of this much, then you begin to respond by telling the story. You know what? I was in a bad place too. I was up to my eyeballs in debt. There was no way I was going to get out of it. In fact, I know what was going to happen. I was going to lose my family because I was going to be put in a debtor's prison. And I would have had to work there until I paid off the entirety of the debt. And you know what? You don't get the same wage in the debtor's prison. What was an 8-year debt probably for me would have become a 16-year debt or maybe a lifetime of debt. And probably my children would have had to go into bond service or slavery to help pay off my debt. But this man, y'all, this man said, you know what? I know your situation. You don't owe me a thing. And it changed my life. But then as Jesus tells the story, Simon replied just as anyone would. He said, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. See, he responds to that story the same way many of us would. All right, it's obvious, Jesus. Get on with it. Let's get to the punchline. I suppose the guy with the bigger debt. See, he's still blind in the midst of this narrative. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. And it's as if in that moment, Jesus is looking at Simon the Pharisee and says, your headspace is right, but your heart place is dead wrong. Let's listen with your ears, Simon, and not your sarcasm. Don't let your history cloud your judgment. Just because you've been educated in the best places, just because people come to you for answers, just because people look to you for judgment, don't assume that you have the right. Realize that your position is the result of the mercy of the Master. You see, what's really crazy about this story is that the sinful woman had the King of Kings in her heart. And the religious leader had the King of Kings in his house. And was not amazed by it. You see, I believe that her tears were tears of sorrow and repentance, but also her tears were tears of joy and expectation. And here's why I believe that to be true. He turned to the woman, verse 44, and he said, Simon, you see this woman? Came into your house, didn't give me any water for my feet. She wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Didn't give me a kiss. This woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Simon, she sees me, and you are the one who is blind. You see, I believe she understood Hebrews 4:16 that says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace so that we can receive mercy and find grace and help in our time of need. See, I believe her tears were the response to her understanding of that. Sorrow for her history, but joy in her present. Because this is what Jesus says to her in verse 47, or to Simon. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. Her showing at the feet of Jesus was the result of her love for Jesus, which, as we're learning, results from the mercy of Jesus. You see, we're chosen for forgiveness. But the forgiveness is not just for us. We're chosen for forgiveness so that we can forgive others. There's an expectation that comes with that mercy. We're objects of His mercy so that we can be objects of mercy towards other people. Chosen from His forgiveness for forgiveness of others. In other words, the cookies are His. When you come to the table, the cookies are His. And they're meant to be shared. If He gives you a sleeve of cookies, He expects you to eat half and give half to the people around you. Because they're His. They're not ours. People don't earn our mercy. They receive it because we received it from Jesus. We're chosen from the mercy of Jesus for mercy towards others. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. You see, Simon, you've got me in your house, but you don't have me in your heart. I imagine if Simon were around us today, he'd have art on his walls with Bible verses on them. I believe when you came to the door, the welcome mat would have some psalm on the welcome mat. That there would be a cross somewhere in the house. That his screensaver on his phone would be something spiritual. That he would have God all over his house. But he wouldn't have God in his heart. Because what illustrates having God in our hearts? It's repentance. A change of mindset that leads to a change in behavior. And it's appreciation that results in behaving towards others as He has behaved towards us. You see, when you realize how much mercy you've been given, then you have the fuel to be merciful towards others. And if you refuse to see it, well, then there's trouble coming. Because Jesus' words are also that the measure we use for others is the measurement God will use for us. However you've chosen to judge somebody else's life with whatever magnifying glass you've put up to their choices, with whatever ferocity you've gone through their Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter feeds, with whatever passion you've pursued in their history, so that you can make a judgment about whether they're worthy or not to come into your house, Jesus, with the same passion, will look at your history to judge whether or not you're worthy to be in His. And so there's a lot at stake in the way that we choose to treat others. And whether that treatment of others is true and honest or fake and put on. You see, the Pharisee invited Jesus into his house, but not so that he could have Jesus into his home. And the sinful woman was desperate to have Jesus as part of her life. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7, in the Beatitudes, Jesus says these words, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive," guess what? Mercy. Blessed are the merciful, they are the ones, they will receive mercy. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13, Jesus says this, quoting the Old Testament, "I want you to go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Dwell on that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Luke chapter 7 is a story of a man who had Jesus in his home and a woman who had Jesus in her heart. And so I ask you, do you want to be measured by his mercy or your own sense of righteousness? If you've not yet put yourself at the feet of Jesus, we'll give you this invitation today to proclaim him as your Lord, to unite yourself with him as you offer your life to him in the waters of baptism. If you've united yourself with Jesus and you've found that you've kind of gone your own way, that you've invited him into your home, but you haven't actually invited him into your life or into your heart, if there is some mercy that you need to offer others that you have withheld, and you need help with that, because let's be honest, it's not always easy, I want to invite you to go ahead and stand up, everyone. We're about to sing a song. And as we sing, come down and let us know, and we'll pray for you.